Find the domain of each expression. In our first few examples, we're going to have rational expressions. That's a fancy word for a fraction with algebraic terms in the top and bottom. We start with x minus 6 over 1 minus 9x. If your expression is rational, the domain is all the values of x for which you could substitute in for x and not have a zero denominator. Well, that's going to be a whole lot of numbers, so the best way to work these out, the most efficient way, is to find out what does make your denominator zero and just not use it. 1 minus 9x is equal to 0. Let's add 9x's to both sides, and that leaves us with 1 equals 9x. Divide both sides by 9, and we find that x equals 1/9. Now, remember, we don't want a zero denominator, so the domain is all real numbers such that x isn't or not equal to 1/9. In the next example, we have x squared minus 1 over x squared plus 3x minus 18. Our domain with rational expressions, we only focus on the denominator. Remember that we don't want that to be 0. Dividing by 0 is undefined. X squared plus 3x minus 18 can be factored with x minus 3 times x plus 6. Remember, with trinomials, the sum of these numbers have to have a middle value. So negative 3 plus 6, that's positive 3. The product of your numbers has to equal your constant. So negative 3 times 6, that's negative 18. The sum equals the middle value. The product equals the constant. The first factor is equal to 0 when x equals 3. The second factor is equal to 0 when x equals negative 6. Your domain is all real numbers such that x isn't 3 and isn't negative 6. Remember, we're taking sort of a backdoor approach. We find out what makes the denominator 0, and we just don't use those. If you switch to what's called a radical expression, you'll see a square root many times. We have the square root of 2x minus 5. If you happen to have a calculator handy, type in square root of 0, hit enter. Type in square root, just pick any positive number and hit enter. You're always going to get some kind of numerical answer. The moment you try to take the square root of something negative, a lot of times your calculator will give you an error message. And that's because the square root of a negative, you can't find a number such that if you multiplied it times itself, you would get a negative answer. For example, 7 times 7 is positive 49. Even negative 7 times negative 7 is also positive 49. You never get a negative value. Long story short, you take the terms under the radical, 2x minus 5, and you just make sure that they're either positive or equal to 0. Mathematically, that's greater than or equal to 0. Solving for x, we add 5 to both sides. That leaves us with 2x greater than or equal to positive 5. And then we divide by 2. So x greater than or equal to 5 divided by 2. Your domain is made up of exactly these numbers. Remember, we want to square root positives or 0. We just found out where that happens. So your domain is all real numbers such that those numbers are greater than or equal to 5/2. Let's look at a second example. Square root of 6 minus x. Remember, this square root, we want it to be either positive or 0. So that'll happen as long as 6 minus x is greater than or equal to 0. Add x to both sides. That gives us 6 greater than or equal to x. Another way to write it, and it might be easier to read, is if you rotate all this around. Remember, if the arrow points at the x, when you rotate, it will still need to point towards the x. Another way to read that is any value of x less than or equal to 6. Your domain is all real numbers such that those real numbers are less than or equal to 6. Now, when we get ready to do combinations, you will run into square roots that are in the denominator. 1 divided by square root of x minus 4, because that's a square root, x minus 4 can be positive or 0. But the moment it also goes into a denominator, you have to remove the possibility of being 0. So if you can only be positive, the mathematical way to say that is x minus 4 has to strictly be greater than 0. We can't underline it because of the denominator. We don't want a 0 down here. Add 4 to both sides, x greater than 4. So your domain is all real numbers such that they are greater than 4. And then our example to the right, 1 over square root of x plus 2. Again, because it's under a radical and in the denominator, it can only be positive. X plus 2 is greater than 0 when x is greater than negative 2. And so your domain is made up of all values of x greater than negative 2.